Welcome to Emotion Well, EFR's podcast about all things related to emotional well-being. I'm Johanna Dunlevy, the EAP Operations Director for Employee and Family Resources, also known as EFR, and I'm the host of our podcast. As an FYI, EFR is located in Des Moines, Iowa, and we are Iowa's first employee assistance program and provide a variety of services you can learn more about at www.efr.org. I am here today with Emily Manternach. Emily is someone who I met last fall at a leadership boot camp that was hosted by a mutual connection of ours, Molly Mackey. And then I remember, it was a 2-day boot camp, Emily, and I remember the morning of the second day, I'm like, you're at the YMCA, you're working out at the YMCA in the same Pilates bar class as me. So I was like, we're destined to connect more. So welcome to the podcast, Emily. Share a little bit about yourself with our listeners.
Yeah, most definitely. And Pilates and bar is wonderful. It's definitely something that's helped me in my life, as well as yoga. And so previously in my life, I was a chemical engineer, and then I went full-time as an entrepreneur. And now I do a lot more around the life skills that we want to practice through life coaching, as well as health and well-being, and practicing with personal training, different classes and things like that. Forgiveness has been something that we cover during my life training. It's actually a couple weeks during a 9-week program. And so it's nice to be able to chat with you on that today.
Yeah, so that's what we're talking about today. I'm excited.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how do you go from chemical engineering? Did you go to Iowa State University by any chance?
I did.
All right. So how do you go from ISU chemical engineering grad to, I would say, like a pretty big pivot, or maybe it's not as big of a pivot? You tell me.
So from the outside looking in, I could totally see that. A lot of people see it as that you're like, whoa, what are you doing going into this? When I went into chemical engineering, there was a lot where I was interested in the environment as well as people. And so that is part of what I did. I definitely did things to support the environment through the engineering work that I was doing. But engineering is a lot about solving problems, looking at things from a system perspective. And so when we take a step back and you look at that at either like a facility where you're at and you're either one person or one team or department working within that facility or that business, and then you look at all the other parts fitting into the system as a whole, it made a lot more sense. So as I was doing environmental or safety work, it kind of went into that. And we look at the body that way too. The mind, the spirit, they all kind of come together.
Yeah. So then when you pivoted your career path, did you go through some different trainings or coursework, or how did you become, like you said, you're now an entrepreneur and you have areas of expertise in yoga and life coaching and health and well-being. So how did you make that pivot?
I actually did both for about 8 years. So I was teaching yoga. I got my certification and a number of other certifications. And then since then, it was something that I was continuing to learn about. As I had people come to classes through my first few yoga classes, started out as once a week, shortly went to twice a week. And then soon I was like, wait, I'm teaching like 10 classes and working full time. So, kind of evaluating what that looks like. And, there's way more to going to a group exercise class or to even yoga where we're talking about community. We're talking about an individual understanding themselves and understanding how the group dynamics are working and kind of accepting some of those things about themselves. And so through the trainings, through yoga and other things, Ayurveda, people would ask about different things, whether it was about, okay, why am I feeling this in class? And so I dove in deeper into some of the Ayurvedic and nutrition. What can we do to prevent dis-ease in the body? And then when I did go full time, it was more about, okay, what's the bigger picture? So not only movement, getting the body moving, or the meditation, getting the mind thinking and processing things, but also spirit. So where are we coming from when we talk about our real purpose in life? And that's kind of how the coaching comes in to support all of that.
Yeah, I love that. And now that when I asked you about pivoting from chemical engineering into what you're doing now, and I said it feels like a big shift, you're right. Like it is just, it's a different type of system you're focusing on, right? it's about like systemic change and, just embracing that. So I love it. I love it when people make career changes. And I also love it when someone has, like a side gig that turns into something that they're so passionate about. They just kind of pivot to that completely. So today we're going to talk about forgiveness. And I don't even know how, or I don't remember how we came up with this as a topic, but I think we chatted about it. I know via email, but I think we even chatted about it last fall when we met in person. But this is a topic that we've never really gotten into on the podcast. And I don't think we've ever written a blog about it at EFR or done a webinar about it. So I thought this would be a really fun opportunity to talk about forgiveness. So let's just dig into that topic. And I'm going to lean into your expertise. And we're just going to start with like the very basic, like what is forgiveness? Because I think we all probably know what it is, but what truly is forgiveness?
Forgiveness is really freedom. So when we let go of the experience, we actually release that on an energetic level in the body. Sometimes we might find like, oh, I don't have this pain in my knee or in my hip anymore after going through the forgiveness process. And it's not just a freedom from that experience, it's freedom for all people involved. So whether it's self-forgiveness or whether it's forgiveness for someone else, something else, it is a way of saying that experience is no longer going to define me and hold me back. It's a way to say, you know what, here's what I learned from that experience and how I'm going to move forward and what it'll do to help me be more successful later in life.
Yeah, and I like how you said it's not always about forgiving others, but sometimes it's about forgiving yourself. And I think that, at least in my own experiences, I'm harder on myself. I give other people a lot more grace than I give myself. And I think there's probably is a connection between grace and forgiveness, right? And so allowing yourself that space to forgive yourself for, something that has transpired in your life. So I love that. Um, do you feel like, so let's talk about kind of two things. One, forgiveness of others, and the second being forgiveness of self. Why might it be challenging, or why do you think people have a hard time taking that step?
I think sometimes we like to hold on to it because it either helps us decide who we want to be. So, anger, for example, is an emotion based off of like a fire element in Ayurveda. And so, if it has fire behind it, right, it's a driving force. The heat of a fire, for example, can really transform something into something else. It takes wood and a campfire, a beautiful thing to have and sit around, and turns it into ash that then goes back into the soil and actually regenerates. It can make the soil even better afterwards, which is really cool. Forgiveness is something like that. We can decide whether we want to leave the ashes from the fire and leave it there or place it somewhere where it can be more helpful in the soil, or we can continue to build more and more of them. And so part of it is when we feel like we're having a struggle with that, it's more about deciding, how do we want to use that fire? Do we want to transform it, or do we want to place it in blame? Do we want to place it in someone else's hands? And not only that, sometimes in the mind, it's easier to say, well, I'm not able to do that because this happened. And then we don't have to go through the fear or the trials of doing something that is a little bit out of our comfort zone. When we do go through the process, we can say, well, oh, maybe I can do that thing even without this experience holding me back. For example, in a loving relationship, right? Sometimes it's easier to be like, well, they did this, right? Well, in any relationship, with ourselves, with other people, with our pets, with our plants, all the different things in our lives, it's two-sided, right? So it has to be a part of both people for that to happen, no matter what. And so our internal reaction is part of what's defining for us what happened. during that experience and how we're seeing it. So then when we reprocess it, we think about the forgiveness, we do work through, well, okay, I've already defined that it's this experience and that's how it is, rather than considering maybe what our part in that process is, or considering, I can give myself grace because it's important, because we've got to love ourselves just as much as we love others. And that makes us better at loving others too.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you said it's really it's part of a bigger relationship, right? So no matter who the relationship is between, forgiveness is about choosing freedom, choosing to let go, choosing to release. I love that. Um, I I know that you've heard of this because I think everyone has heard of like the oh, I forgive but I never forget. And to me, that feels kind of like maybe it's not actually forgiveness. Like, I forgive but I don't forget. What what would you say to someone who maybe has that mentality? Do you feel like they've truly embraced forgiveness, or do you think they're still holding on to a little bit because they're not forgetting, or they're kind of committed to keeping that with them?
Yeah. So forgiveness is freedom so that we can love more in a way, right? And if we're holding on to something and not forgetting it, when we look at that person, whether it's ourselves or someone else, doing the mirror work like Louise Hay
Sure.
talks about, right? Um, when we're holding on to that and remembering that and saying, well, that's, there's something there about why we're remembering it, we're actually using that as a way to say, I'm going to be this way with that person. But when we truly look at it, if we're holding that, are we actually being loving towards that person? Because we don't know exactly what their circumstances are today or what's going on with them in that current situation. We know what happened then or how we were then, but it might not be what's going on today. And I think it's important. Sometimes when this comes up, I talk about forgiving and learning. So, if someone's saying, hey, I'm going to forgive but not forget, there's no harm necessarily in that as long as we're still able to act with love and be who we want to be, you know,
Sure.
and do those things with a loving perspective. But if we can forgive and learn and say, almost like, I'm going to let them be who they are and not have judgment for that. And I'm going to let
Yeah.
myself be who I want to be and then move forward with that. I feel like it's much more learning experience than it is about
Yeah.
defining that's how that person's going to be or how I want to be just because of one experience.
Yeah, and forward focused. Like I love the forgive and learn because it truly is then forward focused versus like forgive but never forget. Like you're still in some way I think kind of stuck in whatever had happened. I love that. You mentioned just a moment or two ago the mirror approach, or what did you say? What is that? Share more.
So mirror work is a process that Louise Hay had. So, yep. So she talks a lot about how if you look at yourself in the mirror, the thoughts that come up and the feelings that come up are important, right? We want to look at ourselves and see ourselves as a spiritual being and then really send love into that experience because that's when we can feel that we're really connected to spirit and connected to that greater purpose of who we are, right? And when we can see that for ourselves, it's definitely easier to see that in others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard of Louise Hay. And so I'm going to look more into mirror work, and or I can even include some of that information in the show notes for our listeners. So let's say someone wants to have a conversation around forgiveness. Maybe I want to have a conversation with someone who I would like to forgive. What would you recommend as some easy first steps and how to kind of complete that process?
So I think there's a couple different ways to do that. So I'm going to suggest a couple different ways just because it could be different depending on the person. Sometimes there's times where we want to offer forgiveness and it might be for someone who's still, present in life. So that might be different than someone who maybe has passed or something, you're not able to interact with in person. It might also be something where we want to forgive ourselves for that experience happening in our lives. And, there's different ways. So you could write a letter. The letter might be forgiveness enough to release if there's multiple people involved, and that could be if someone's alive or if they're passed. Because energetically, we're still putting the energy into releasing that and letting go from it. It could also be, and then a person could burn that, if you wanted, or because then it kind of transforms itself, just like the fire we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's a good way. There are other ways to do it, like, writing the letter. You can actually give it to them. You could practice the conversation that you want to have before you go into that. You might even write the letter to yourself so that you know how you want to mentally think about and emotionally think about for that experience. Because sometimes once we release it, that forgiveness process and conversation with the other person can become a whole lot easier, where they're like, oh, I didn't realize. Or they're like, of course. It really does depend on what it is, too. I think there are some different things about severity or other things. There's also times where maybe we're not in contact or we choose not to be in contact with someone. And that's perfectly okay, where the letter, to ourselves or to the other person is helpful. A metta meditation, this is actually from the Dalai Lama, is really great. Metta meditation is a meditation on love. And one of the best ways to do it is to wish them well. So the
Yeah.
simplest version is to say, think about something that you really love first, so that you know in your body what it feels like to experience that love. So this may be like your favorite pet. It may be like the most favorite person in your life, because when you think about that, you really feel that. And then you start to think about, okay, yourself in that situation and how you felt, and send love to that experience and that version of yourself. And then you send love and well wishes to the other person. And you practice this as often as you can until you start to really feel a similarity between that initial part where you have your pet that you love the most or your favorite person. And when you're
Yeah.
thinking about the other person, it feels similar, because then you know that internally you're not thinking about it as much. It doesn't actually, the neurology of it is that those neurons won't fire as often where you're holding the issue in the tissue, per se, or in the emotion. And eventually you're going to you really are going to want to wish the other person or yourself the best, because ultimately we do want everyone in life to live their best and be their happiest version. So
I like how you just said holding the issue in the tissue. And I've never heard that before, but I understand it. I've heard the concept around it. Can you explain that, a little bit of that to our listeners? What physically happens or neurologically happens to us when we hold on to, feelings like anger or resentment?
yeah, definitely. So we can dive in even further at some point where, each of the organs are associated with different emotions as well. And they actually
Okay.
help us process. For the example, the liver holds anger. So if we have something going on in the liver, it might be an indicator that there is something we're angry about or we haven't focused on. The issue in the tissue is more about how we're feeling it in the body. So, for example, last June, and this is just a simple, maybe relatable example. Last June, I was in my car and I got rear-ended. And, I was like, okay, I was fine. I had very little medical issues. I did end up going to the doctor to get checked, right? Wanted to make sure I was okay, and had some chiropractor sessions afterwards. The car got repaired. Overall, everybody was safe and happy. However, as I was starting to pull up to certain places, I could feel myself being like, oh, I'm tensing. And I was like, why are you tensing when you have driven for how many years in your life? And out of those years, you've had one experience of a car accident. And it was like, well, the body was feeling not safe. It was starting to adjust because of that one experience. So it took some time, but it was like, okay, as I'm pulling up to the stop sign, I'm going to say, I'm safe, I'm okay. Yes, I'm still going to check my mirrors and, if I need to stop a little bit sooner. But that's somewhat what I mean about the issue in the tissue, right? When we have an experience, we start to feel a certain way that takes us a little bit to rewind that, relax it, let the nervous system release that in the body. And so I imagine there's other examples out there too, of bicycle accidents, different things, an argument that the next time somebody gives you that look, you're like, oh, is that happening again? Well, not necessarily.
It reminds me of the book The Body Keeps the Score, just kind of along those lines of how the body remembers, whether it's a physical trauma or an emotional trauma. I've had a similar experience with a fender bender from several years ago, and my massage therapist at the time, and he was very in tune with how trauma can affect the body and how patterns can develop and show up. And maybe there was nothing I did to trigger this, but all of a sudden it's like I can't turn my neck very far in one direction, and it was always kind of like on the same side of my body, affecting kind of my range of motion and mobility of my neck. And we would always just talk about how like it's like my body was holding on to this pattern of trauma from this fender bender from years ago. And like you, like there was nothing serious, like at all. I was fine. I just couldn't let go of it. And so I think, for our listeners, if you have ever noticed something, in your body that is a pattern or repeating itself, and you're kind of questioning like, what is this coming from? Or why is this the case? Like, dig deep. And I guess at the end, we'll talk about some good references like books, podcasts, things that you can look into that Emily recommends. But I love that example. I think it's very relatable. And even to like, you said maybe you had a conversation with someone, and because it went a certain way one time, maybe now you expect that person to always have a similar response, or anything around the topic of that conversation to have a similar, outcome. And so it's a lot of it is just living, to me, in the present moment, being mindful of like, my mind can be in any direction, forward or backward, but my body is physically present. Like I can only be here, in this space physically. So can I align my mind also to be with my body? Because I think a lot of it comes down to that, just mindfulness and being aware and paying attention. So, um, okay, I want to pivot to if you are someone on the receiving end of forgiveness. So I thought of this because years ago I read a book, and maybe you've read it too. I don't know. I didn't ask you, but it's called As We Forgive, Stories of Reconciliation from Rwanda. So it's about the Rwandan genocide, and it's by Catherine Claire Larson. So I read this book. I've actually read it twice, I think. But really what she writes about is she follows, I think, 6 or 7 different families in Rwanda whose lives were, completely devastated by the genocide back in the early to mid 1990s. And these people go back and they forgive the people who killed their families and who took part in the genocide. And her whole point of the book was that forgiveness does so much more for the person choosing to forgive than it often does for the person who's maybe done something wrong and who is accepting forgiveness. So I thought about that a lot, and we talked a lot about how like by choosing to forgive, it is freedom. But if you are on the other side and it's like you are the recipient of someone who is reaching out to forgive you, what are some things that you would encourage someone to do, if they're in that type of a conversation?
It's a beautiful thing. And I think the freedom is a great way to describe what you're talking about. And it's not always easy. There's some, death row type stories out there too about people forgiving, who might have killed their daughter or other people, which is really, really amazing. The genocide being a broader example of how a country impact. The forgiveness process does take both people. So a lot of times if someone's coming to you, they're coming with love and humility and saying like, hey, this happened. And one of the best things is to accept it and say, yeah, I do forgive you. I do encourage people to be honest. If they're personally still holding on to that, maybe taking a moment to pause and, honoring the courage of the person coming to them and offering that forgiveness and saying, hey, that took a lot of courage. I need some time to think about that. That's perfectly okay and within the realm of being a human being and saying, I need some time. But we do want to honor the gift that someone's offering when they are saying, hey, I want to process this and be a part of this experience with you. It's oftentimes also opening up in the relationship, and we don't all choose to be vulnerable with everybody in our lives. So it is an opportunity to honor that and really celebrate and enjoy that time. So I'm not saying you need to jump up and down or give big hugs if that's not how you feel. You surely can if that's how you feel. Sometimes those things are a big deal. In the Bible, the story about the gentleman coming home, right? The father forgave him. Things were just different when they transpired over the rest of that person's lives. However, they had a feast. They enjoyed the experience, and it takes a lot of courage to be able to offer that. So taking the time to do it in a way that continues to build the relationship, and that has a greater effect on not just those, the people involved, but the ripple effect of the people that they're connected to and other experiences that could come up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ripple effect was something that the book I cited earlier really talked a lot about, was like how a conversation between two people can impact so many and, just lift everyone up. It's not just the two people involved in the conversation. So I love that. And then I talked a little bit about mindfulness, but do you have any tips or tricks on how to be more present and in the moment? Because I think a lot of that is related to what we're talking about, is just being aware, being self-aware, or being aware of relationship dynamics, acceptable behavior, honoring boundaries, things like that. What would you recommend for someone who's trying to work on mindfulness?
So mindfulness for me and in my perspective is a lot, well, actually, before I get into that, you mentioned it too, like our mind can be multiple places, but being present in the body. So with that, feeling the breath, really being able to consciously say, okay, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. That doesn't mean that's all we need to focus on, but when we can do that, we know that we're more present in the body where we're at rather than having the mind in the future or in the past. And not only that, when we can connect with our heartbeat, that's like another great way to really connect with the physical and say, wow, like without that, we wouldn't be here today. The breath keeps the heartbeat going, and how beautiful it is that it continues without, a lot of things in our lives where, we have other devices or things in our lives that you have to plug them in, do other things to make them work. So those are some of the simplest ways. Yeah. And not only that, just being mindful. So when we write our name, the words we speak, thinking about them. It's not only about the reaction that we have, it's more about the response. So when we take that moment of pause before we respond, we're actually able to be more present too, because we can honor and say, I thought about the other person involved in this situation, or, I thought about this a little bit more for myself even, because there are times where things can come up pretty fast and you're like, okay, well, here's what I'd like to do. But then we later have those feelings of, well, did I really want to eat the whole container of ice cream, for lack of a better example.
Right, right.
Um, but when we are being mindful, we know that it's going to feel really good to have a couple of bites and not, eat the whole container. So,
Well, and the thing with mindfulness is that it can be practiced in all aspects of life. It could be mindful eating, it could be mindful driving, it could be, mindful use of your phone, and in your screen time. I always think like a lot of the things that we do mindlessly were once a very mindful activity. So my daughter has known how to tie her shoes now for several years, but when we were first learning how to tie shoes, it was like such a slow and deliberate and thought out process. And she really couldn't focus on anything but the loops and when she would crisscross and when she would, pull the laces tight. But now, just a few years later for her, and of course, like many years later for me, it's like tying my shoes. Like I can do so many other things. Like I can carry on a conversation with someone. I can be, mentally somewhere else when I'm tying my shoes. So like you said, just writing your name, like taking something that you do rather mindlessly and then just spending a little time on it with more intention could just be a way to practice or flex that mindful muscle. So I love that. And then that also has a ripple effect into other, when you're maybe set to have a really important conversation or you need to make a big decision, you've had these little small wins along the way or these opportunities to practice mindfulness prior to that. So I love that. What book recommendations or resource recommendations do you have for our listeners around anything we talked about today? Forgiveness, mindfulness, yoga. I know we didn't talk a lot about yoga, but you are a yoga instructor. And so what resources do you have for people?
so Radical Forgiveness by Colin Tipping is a really, really good book about forgiveness itself. And that's one of the ones that I feel like is a great one to read. And then Thich Nhat Hanh has these little books that's like how to love, how to forgive, how to walk. And they're really beautiful because, there's short little parts on the page, but it does bring you into that mindfulness. And I think those are great ones for just being mindful, but also bringing that in. And then there is, personally, I do a 5-day challenge on forgiveness with another coach. So if somebody was interested in that, and we talk through the stages of the forgiveness process, and how give tools on how maybe to go about doing it. So if someone's interested in that, they're short videos, about 15 minutes. So that way you can do them in the morning and you can journal throughout the day or go through that too. So
and I'm going to link to your website. So for our listeners, be sure to go to the show notes so you can catch Emily's website. But do you want to just say what it is now for people listening if they want to hear it in the moment?
Sure, definitely. It is www.embodyinnmindyoga.com.
I will put it in the show notes, and then people can just click all the way through to your website. This was such a fun conversation. I feel like it left people curious to learn more about forgiveness and mindfulness. And so I would encourage everyone to check out Emily's website. She's also one of our newest life coaches here at EFR. So if you're listening and you have EAP benefits through EFR, you do have access to life coaching. So you can call our 800-327-4692 number, and then you can get connected with a life coach. If you felt like Emily was someone who resonated with you through the podcast today, maybe she could even be available to coach you. Our coaching sessions are all virtual or over the phone. So it doesn't matter where you live and where she lives, you can still connect with her, but you'd want to connect directly through your EAP benefit for that. So again, 800-327-4692. Emily, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a great conversation, and we look forward to continuing our partnership.
Yes, thank you so much, Johanna. I appreciated it.
Thank you for listening to Emotion Well. Employee and Family Resources is a 501c3 nonprofit organization located in Des Moines, Iowa. We support communities, workplaces, and schools with comprehensive behavioral health services. If you would like to contribute to our mission, please click on the donation link in our show notes.